Ani, ani bojuan denwe maganadok. Ujawashko benishi indigo. Bronson and Dishnakas. Maingen and Dodem. Waawiyaatanong and Dunjaba. Odawa minwa. Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Dao. In Dinawe maganadok. So, ani boju. Bindigan, welcome. I just kind of gave a formal introduction in Anishinaabe Moan. It's just kind of some of the protocol, and that's when you go to different communities, different reservations, different reserves, but just different land in general. It's that introduction. For a lot of people, I know they'll carry around their sema, their tobacco. They'll keep it in a pouch. And what they do is when they travel, they'll bring that with them on journeys, and it's the first thing you lay down as an offering, kind of gratitude. And even for me, traveling here to Chicago, the Chicagoland area, that was one thing that I brought with me and I do on my travels is you lay down that offering, that asema. And I've been taught that asema is that first medicine. I've also been taught that asema, you always start with asema, that tobacco. And that's even for advice. And I've heard it called the umbilical cord to the universe. It's kind of that contract. You have a question, you seek out an elder, even a favor, and it's kind of that contract. It's implied. There's no paperwork, there's no documents. It's just kind of having that word and upholding that word. And I've even heard it, if you offer someone tobacco, you trust them with your life. Um, and that goes for Sweat Lodge. So the Siwan Sweat Lodge, who's conducting, that's kind of been protocols. You offer tobacco to that firekeeper and that person conducting that ceremony, and you're entrusting with them. This was touched on earlier, but during that land acknowledgement and for the opening, but this name of Chicago, French rendering of it from the Miami, Illinois was bit butchered, but Chicago, and in that language, is referred to, it comes from the wild onion, the wild leek, the striped skunk in this region. And in Ojibwe, it's Gigangong, on the skunk. So there's a few natives I know they grew up in Chicago and some Potawatomis, and I just tell them I'm going to Chicago. They go, "Oh, you're going to the stinky place." It has that ecological sort of knowledge and meaning behind it. And even in Michigan, there's Pinconning, Michigan, and that's Opinkanang, place of the potato. The land kind of has that knowledge in those words and those terms. So I just want to do a bit of a brief song for you all. Usually for openings and closings, there's a song, and for this particular song, I haven't shared it with a lot of people, but it came to me during fasting camp. I did a fasting camp up in Sugar Island, and that's located Upper Peninsula of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, near Ontario. And with that, a song that kind of came to me. So I'll just do a brief version, keep it brief. I know we got some time limits, but it goes like this. It goes way ah hey ah way ah hey. Way ah way ah way ah hey. Bend again, dee dee see. Bend again, dee dee see. Way ah, hey. Way ah, hey. So that's just a brief kind of introduction song. Um, Usually I'd have a drum with me, but I brought this this shishiwan, and that's a shaker, that's a rattle, and I've been carrying it, traveling with it, to different events. We had a staff retreat in Boston last week, and I brought it, and for me, it's kind of symbolic. This shishiwan, this rattle. I mean, that you look at all cultures. I mean, that's one of the first toys you have as a child. And looking at our clan systems of animals and species and beings in this whole scheme of creation as human beings, we're kind of the new kids on the block. We have a lot to learn. I'd even say we have a lot to unlearn as well with a lot of these different systems and entities and institutions as well. And one other thing too is for these visual gatherings. I'm stealing material from an uncle, from a mentor, and a friend. And really, it's not stealing, but for him, it'd be, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And he's got a birthday coming up on this Friday, Friday the 13th. But during COVID, during lockdown, for us to gather and share in virtual gatherings, he would just ask that everyone have a glass of nibi, just water and a candle. And that water is symbolic. We all come from water, and that water spirit, that Manadu, that spirit in that water, that spirit water, it's in all of the continents and all of the cultures, and each one of us comes through water. Our mothers carried us for all those months, and we came through water. The water broke. And as far as the flame, that's representative of Ishkode, that fire, that sacred flame. And even each and every one of us, you may be going through something difficult or some times or some adversity. And one big thing is if you rub your skin, there's that warmth, that's that sacred fire. So, um, that was just something big during lockdowns and COVID, but something virtual. I think it's very symbolic. It's a reminder of that connection in a time of a lot of division and issues and things going on in our world. So, yeah, for this particular image here, my friend got these from, it was University of Michigan's Round Dance. Not sure who the artist was, but I thought this was like very just a great representation of the Anishinaabe nation, of really how massive it is. So for me personally, I mentioned in my introduction, I come from Waawiyaatanong, and that's the place where the curved shores meet, and that's Metro Detroit. Additionally, it is Windsor, Ontario. Like all of that area is Waawiyaatanong. And the big thing emphasized here, for Anishinaabe, the land, Anishinaabe land was for Anishinaabe and other First People, Indigenous, Natives, Indians, however, whatever term you prefer. We never crossed borders. Borders crossed us. And with this image, I mean, you look at current modern maps and globes and things, and it's, you look at this current division between the US and Canada, and it's unsettling, it's unnecessary, it seems so backwards, these connections we have. But again, this is a reminder that this culture um, predates the whole concept of nation states, two nation states. And frankly, it will exist after these two nation states and before. But previously these waterways here shown on this particular image traveled freely between the straits, and Migration was essential during specific seasons of harvesting and hunting and foraging, and animals migrated and individuals did as well. You kind of had a base camp or an outpost or somewhere, but this importance of movement, being in rhythm with this movement and following these signs and signals. And one other thing is, you'll hear the term mashkiki, and that's like medicine. And if you break it down, mashkiki is strength from the earth. And you look at all these different forms of medicine that are at our disposal, that are there, that aren't scripts, aren't prescriptions. And that's one thing is I've really leaned into with some traditional healers, these traditional approaches for these things. And another thing, it's interesting, we do land acknowledgments, and there's one individual, he broke it down well, and he said, he's been taught that there never really is an appropriate land acknowledgement. Um, there was some changes as far as territory. You look at the history of like the Haudenosaunee and some of these other nations as well. But again, the big thing there's a previous Ogama, previous chief from Bequejoong unceded territory, and that's over in Walpole Island, Ontario, over on like Lake St. Clair, not too far from Port Huron, Michigan. And this particular individual would say, you're on your G-Mon, you're in your canoe, and you're on the St. Clair River, and you're heading towards Michigan, Port Huron, and oh, excuse me, Algonac, Michigan. Port Huron's up near Sarnia, so you're heading near Algonac, Michigan, and you're in your canoe, and you're crossing the river, and there's all of a sudden a bump, and you feel the bump, and you're like, oh, that must have been the border. But then you keep going, you're like, oh no, that wasn't it. And then you hit another bump, and you're like, oh, that must be the border now. But it's just kind of tongue in cheek, really, of some of these international borders and how they were divided, and these forms of colonization in the Americas, and you even look at the continent of Africa as well, dividing some of these culturally relevant or significant groups and dividing into new nation states. So there has been some efforts, as far as some land back initiatives. For the Detroit Land Back Authority, they offered an auction. It was 50% discount on properties for those that were able to provide, their Indian status or tribal ID. So, there are efforts out there. Interesting thing about Detroit is a very multicultural area in particular. So yeah, like this slide right here has some of the treaties that really shaped Michigan, some of the displacement, additionally, relocation, just some of these other initiatives and things that really disrupt that cohesion in our communities. Um, so in Metro Detroit, I'd say there's a lot of native erasure in Southeast Michigan, and just a lot of diversity as well. So yeah, these are just some of the treaties. This is a lot of them aren't respected or withheld, but it kind of gives you just a lay of the land of Michigan. And I think the important thing is as well is how I said introducing yourself to the land, the body keeps score. I'm sure you've heard that of trauma, and I more than believe it on the land as well. I mean, much of the chaos, dysfunction, strife in this world is due to the imbalance, not living in balance, not in harmony. These interactions aren't about reciprocity. but rather transactional. And so I'm a Lions fan, Detroit Lions fan, born and bred. I don't know if it's anything to be proud of, but my theory is there's something that must have occurred under Ford Field where the Lions play. You know, they still have that Super Bowl drought, but yeah, it's like there's been places I've gone and there's like a presence, especially like Fort Wayne that's in Detroit. There were some battles and some action back in the day. So certainly the land keeps score. Yeah, if you want to hop to the next slide. So this map right here, I mean, this shows the migration story. For the Anishinaabe, they were originally, we have the Wabanaki out east in Maine, and there's this migration to Waawiyaatanong where the curved shores meet, Detroit, Windsor, and that holds a special significance in the Anishinaabe migration story from the east. So there was a prophecy foretold to the people that told them to keep venturing west until they encountered it was a prophecy of death and destruction, and basically a group went out west until they encountered a place where the food grew on water. And this prophecy was fulfilled once arriving in the Great Lakes region where they found Mino, the good berry. So that's wild rice. And there were three culturally important locations: Waawiyaatanong, who I mentioned, Bekejwanong, where the waters divide, that's Walpole Island, known as the sweetgrass capital of the world. Some of the best sweetgrass. It's just a very swampy, boggy area. And then additionally, Amjanong at the spawning stream, and that's Sarnia near like Port Huron. So those were three specific places of importance. And then from that, you can see the migration further west from it. So, yeah, if you want to hop to the next slide, then. So this particular image here, I don't know if you all can make it out, but these are bison skulls. And this photo is actually from Glue Works. This is actually they would call it Rougeville, Michigan. It's now modern day, present day Melvindale, Michigan, not far from I-75. There's an interstate there built now. And so these are bison skulls, and they're waiting to be ground up for fertilizer, pigments, glue, and ash. And when they were doing their activities out west, they would ship them east to Detroit for processing. And really, there were some campaigns, with this Western expansion. Colonizers, settlers discovering gold led to this expansion. And with this expansion, there was one hurdle, and the way they phrased it, these aren't my words, but the Indian problem. And the existence and well-being of the bison went hand in hand with the state of the natives. So there's Generals William T. Sherman and Philip Sheridan, and one of their policies, one of their tactics against the Confederate forces was a scorched earth type of policy. And it was their belief the quickest means to convince the Indians to adopt civilized life and settle down was attacking the bison, which held so much significance. And many were slaughtered in target practice by the U.S. Army. Many were slaughtered and keeping only the tongues and specific choices cuts and leaving the rest behind. So this was kind of a full-fledged effort, and like I mentioned, that relationship, that reciprocity, and even culturally, the significance of bison, buffalo, no matter the nation as well. If you want to go to the next slide, please. And if you just look at this quote, take away anything essential for the survival of a people, and they will surrender. As long as the buffalo roamed the plains, so did the Indians. The two were symbiotic. So that real connection to the land, how I said with those migrations or hunting and just some of those seasonal cues as well. If you want to hit the next slide. So this particular image here, it's called The Scream of, and it's from 2017, and it's actually in the Denver Museum. And there's an elder from Northwest Ontario, Fred Kelly. He's a residential school survivor. However, he's done a lot of work on truth and reconciliation, repatriation, rematriation, and this is one particular image that he shared with me in a presentation. And in one of these prophecies, they call it the four horsemen of the Anishinaabe apocalypse. And I don't know if you all can, make out this image, but you see the different levels. You see these four horsemen. So these four horsemen are the Indian agent, the missionary, the police officer, and lastly the game warden. And how these four entities impact the way of life, a way of being. I don't want to jump into all the details, but I mean, you even look in the day and age now in the news and this tactic of family separation. And with this, certainly denying access to traditional foods, to the lands, access to medicines. And from this family separation, you not only had the residential and boarding schools, but you had 60 scoop survivors. And those were native children that were placed in non-native households. I think it's I don't know. I kind of scratch my head, but you think you look at some of these residential school or boarding school survivors, and they're the only alumni where previous students are referred to as survivors. And I think that is really sort of like significance. It certainly plays a part with some of the dysfunction and health disparities and things impacting Indian country that a lot of times, this campaign against the bison seems like so long ago, where you still have the impact, the waves from things that, frankly, there were some boarding schools. There's one, Holy Childhood in Harbor Springs, Michigan. I was living up there. That's northwestern on Lake Michigan. That one closed in 1983. So that significance. And then in 1978, that was the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. That was up until 1978. So, there's still fresh wounds. There's still that process of healing. And for a lot of folks, I know they've worked on truth and reconciliation. And I think for a lot of us, it's working towards that or on that truth as well. So if you want to skip ahead. And these are just some of the schools that were listed or noted. I've heard reports of more. The state of Michigan actually did a statewide report on this. Previously, from other work, I worked with a lot of residential school survivors, boarding school survivors, and descendants. And for a lot of them, they were just not around the culture. They may not know their clan, may not know their name, spirit colors. The way I've heard it described is it was for a lot of people during those times, people that lived camouflaged. They had to run away from themselves, and they really couldn't be their authentic selves for survival. And for some descendants and folks I know, there may be this like guilt of not knowing, or some shame or frustration, or a lot of mixed emotions. But really, it's not blaming those ancestors or relatives. We didn't know what they had to endure to ensure their survival. But the cool thing is just from previous gigs and work projects was I was embarking on this healing journey with these boarding school survivors and 60 scoop survivors and descendants, but I was walking hand in hand with them on my own sort of healing journey. And I'd even say for myself, growing up, I didn't have the right toolkit to cope. I didn't know what a sweat was. I didn't use the medicines. I really didn't know. But through work, through jobs, through gigs, through projects, really kind of immersing in the culture. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, the concept of blood memory, in which, there's this ancestral knowledge, there's these teachings and these things, and it's almost sort of dormant. It's there. However, in the right environment, under the right circumstances, it's kind of those embers are back again, a spark. And the really cool thing is I've experienced this firsthand with some of these folks I worked with. And even the term survivors, you'll hear that. I like to refer to them as thrivers. Some of them are really on this campaign of truth telling, sharing stories, sharing things they've never shared before. But again, like I said, through that truth and reconciliation process. Again, I was referring to that uncle in the beginning, and he says, healing isn't pretty, and healing isn't about feeling good. It's about accepting all the parts of you. So I'll check in with him once in a while, and for ceremony, or I'm going to a sweat, and he goes, "How was the sweat?" I go, "Good." He goes, "Did you get dirty?" And I go, "Yeah." And he goes, "Very good." It's that process of healing, confronting some of those things. And then this is just a map. In the state of Michigan, we have 12 federally recognized tribes, and you see, where they're located. We do have some state recognized tribes as well, some that are still in the process of that fight for federal recognition. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this image here, again, I touched on sort of modern day, recent disputes or conflicts with say settlers, colonizers, however you want to describe them. But these particular image here are from the Walleye Wars, and so gill nets are an important fishing practice for Anishinaabe throughout the Great Lakes region. And these particular ways of life, were centered around fishing villages, and they were able to raise corn, squash, beans. You'll hear about like the Three Sisters. And this was just another form of sustenance for fishing instead of fishing and hunting. And for many tribes in Michigan, it's whitefish. Like that is the fish, especially in the Upper Peninsula. But it wasn't until the late 1970s and 1980s when treaty rights were finally honored by some state governments and federal government. So during this particular time in Wisconsin, this was the Walleye Wars. And during this particular time, many native fishers faced forms of intimidation, faced the risk of fines, arrests, and in particular, many for fishing commercially without a proper license, using the gill net, which was considered illegal equipment. And this whole process involved tribal members forced to attend court hearings with municipalities. And then on top of this, just encountering forms of intimidation by the general public, state law enforcement, and the DNR as well. And there was examples of individuals putting sugar in gas tanks of boats, slashing of tires, nails spread on the road, forms of violence including firearms being used, slingshots, throwing stones as well, for those fishing. And so this particular period of time was in like the late 1980s, involving the La Cordillera Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, and they were facing a lot of backlash for treaty rights that allowed for spearfishing of walleye. And this is just a glimpse of it. Just with some research and kind of digging, I found out that the same time in Michigan, there were tribal nations. They won the right for using drift nets on Lake Michigan, and they encountered some of this intimidation and some of these tactics. However, it just like wasn't as publicized or documented, or there wasn't a name for, say like the walleye wars. So, next slide, please. So this is just a quote here, um, and it just says, "We grieve more because we have been disconnected from our earth, our first mother, our spiritual mother." And I discussed some of the tactics from the past, from sort of the present, and moving forward. But I would say, in general, overall, not just for Anishinaabe, but for people in general, we have this separation from that first original mother, Shkakimikwe, that mother, that provides so much for us. And I mentioned before about the sweetgrass from Walpole Island, Ontario. That sweetgrass is considered the hair of Mother Earth, and the way you harvest and, protocol, it's in that respectful way. But I think just in general, kind of collectively, we're really sort of disconnected. And I've heard that the current world we exist in and participate in is, we're all engaged in a collective psychosis, and that the two true realities are language, so culture, and nature. Those are the two things to alleviate, um, some of, this existential crisis or things going on. And I think a lot of doubting ourselves, being dependent on these systems that aren't natural, and kind of returning back to our roots and our way. And I've kind of seen some momentum in different communities as well, folks returning back to the land. And you even look at the Amish community and some of these others, that process of rising with the sun, going to bed with the sun, being on the land, hands in soil and dirt as well. And if you want to get to the next slide, please. And so these are just a few images. I touched on, how I worked with some of these boarding school survivors. And the gentleman in the blue sweater, and he's wearing like the choker, and blue jeans. His name is, Bob Hazen. And Bob Hazen's from Lac Vita, way up in the UP. And he was a student at Holy Childhood. He additionally went to somewhere, Boysville, that was downstate. That was kind of like, for juveniles. And I've been fortunate to be a part of his healing journey, and he's really spoken out. He's been on the trail. But as far as that blood memory, in the one photo, there's Bob Hazen in the middle, and then his wife, Bonnie, and then myself. That was up in Keweenaw Bay Indian Communities powwow a few years ago. That whole concept of blood memory, Bob was around a big drum, and Bonnie was there, and she said Bob was around the big drum. and he started singing, and it was a song that his grandmother taught him when he was a baby. And you know, it came back to him. Like I said, right environment, right circumstances, and it's that spark. So, he wrote this poem. I was just gonna read it, but it's titled "Footsteps in the Shadows," and this is kind of really his experience. I think part of his healing as well. So, "Footsteps in the Shadows." Where have you gone, the boy of my youth? What would have you become? I'd like to know the truth. You run through the shadows of my mind as swift as deer, through the images of you, through the smoke are unclear. The drums of old are silent now, my memories of how it was wane. Nothing much has survived of the past but this terrible pain. Rekindle my spirit like a campfire, and set forth my hopes with a roar. Fill my heart with love and hope. On the wings of eagles, let my future soar. The guns of war are silent now, the warriors have come home. The fears of our past haunt us and cause us to roam. Cast your fear upon the wind, do away with your sorrow, for a new life begins today to share with others tomorrow. And though you run through the shadows of my mind with swiftness and grace, you will always be in my heart with the sun upon my face. So that's from Bob Hayes and Mud Turtle. Also a Vietnam veteran as well. And he's one that I've been able to work with. It's takes some time. It's taken that consistency, but I feel like if you have that right environment, folks are willing to share. So if you just want to skip ahead, these are just some of the initiatives we were able to do, like a panel. If you just want to like go through the other slides, these are just kind of some initiatives, some panels. We did one at Michigan State University, had three Holy Childhood survivors sharing their stories. Just the event in the background behind the panelists, that's actually a healing quilt that some of the grandmothers have been working on. If you just want to skip ahead. Here's Linda Kobe. She actually wrote a book, Red, White, and Blues. She is Bob Hazen's cousin, just a fierce advocate for truth telling. These stories and sharing some of, dark moments of history and some ugly stuff, but really kind of coming to the light. And then you can just skip ahead. A lot of these are just some photos. This is one of the healing quilts. This is at Mount Pleasant in Indian Industrial Boarding School. They do an honoring, healing, remembering event. If you just want to like roll through these, uh, some other survivors from the event. This particular photo here is from Keweenaw Bay Indian community. They do an annual remembrance walk from the old Asinins orphanage up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And if you just want to skip ahead, another talking engagement. This particular lady in the ribbon dress, Deborah Delk, that was the first time she ever publicly spoke about her experience. And, it was on her terms and when she was ready. And she's been on the trail, kind of telling her story as well. Yeah, if you just want to skip ahead, um, yeah, you can just go to the next slide. You can keep going. Just some other events that we've done. Um, and then this particular photo here is actually with some of my current work. So I work with the North American Marine Alliance, and they're out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. However, I'm based in Detroit. I'm able to work remote. And we were fortunate of doing a leadership gathering, a Black and Indigenous leadership gathering down in Mobile, Alabama, in particular Africa Town. And in this particular region or town, there are descendants of the last slave ship to come to the U.S. It was illegal. It was called the Clotilda, and they actually found the ship several years ago. But we were able to work within the community and brought down 30 individuals, fishers, food sovereignty, leaders, and it was just a great collaboration. And then after that, we had a local catch summit. So just nice bringing in kind of different perspectives. So if you want to skip ahead, this is from the local catch summit, but the two gentlemen in the photo, the one in the Seattle Mariners hat, that's Carl, and he lives out in like Seattle area, and then his father Moses is wearing the Bass Pro Shop hat. He came all the way from Alaska, and as I said, it was a bit of culture shock for him going from Alaska to, Alabama, even for myself coming from Michigan. But if you want to go to the next slide, please. But with this work for NAMA, or the North American Marine Alliance, one particular initiative is this campaign of block corporate salmon. There's this genetically engineered salmon by some of these large companies, and with this particular project, we were able to, some folks were able to do a booklet focused on indigenous rights, collaborating with indigenous artists, and really kind of just doing a full scale community effort. With the North American Marine Alliance, a lot of our focus is ensuring food justice, fighting for racial justice, supporting the movement, resisting corporate domination, and additionally working on Catch Share Reform Coalition. And another campaign is Don't Cage Our Oceans. But really, this whole concept of seafood sovereignty as well. We really haven't done a lot of work in the Great Lakes, so that's why I was hired on to focus on some of these freshwater initiatives. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. Loved Anthony Bourdain, was a huge fan, but this quote, "Food is everything we are. It's an extension of nationalist feeling, ethnic feeling, your personal history, your province, your region, your tribe, your grandma. It's inseparable from those from the get-go." Just how important food is, from some of these other presentations and panels and things that we've been hearing earlier and later on this week. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. Um, so this is from the Indigenous Environmental Network, but they provided 6 reasons to harvest. And one of them is to reclaim power in society for women and non-binary members of the community. And with this, originally, Monoman processing was a role for the Kwe, so for women, for the Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Menominee. And the way Anishinaabe families would operate in wild ricing areas, women would handle a lot of these tasks while men would hunt or fish. This was really impacted due to colonization, and when men started processing wild rice solely. That was probably back like World War II, around that time. All right. So, additionally, another component is it allows to reinstate an indigenous economy, kind of this ecosystem or system where it's emphasizing sustainability. And again, like I mentioned, that reciprocity, and honoring each other's sacred role and purpose within the society. And with that, I think that's important of re-establishing that kind of society, is that in turn restores culture. And I think there's a lot of overlap. And by restoring culture, you're able to recover that health. So traditional food production fosters that culture. And culture is prevention. Involves eating, cooking, preserving, teaching. There is that loss of knowledge and the difficulty in accessing traditional foods, but my big thing is little by little. And you have a better understanding of place in creation, responsibilities to creation as well. For recovering health, just a lot of these diets, the colonial diet, high in gluten, dairy, sugar, which are not in pre-contact diets, And as far as Minomin, that wild rice, that's a high nutrition value. And claiming these diets are a form of resistance. I know many of you are probably aware of like the health discrepancies that impact Indian culture as well, and that is, reflected in some of these diets. And additionally, able to exercise treaty rights. So, returning to some of these areas, ancestral lands, excuse me, for fishing, gathering, traveling, ricing, and that whole impact of like taking care of our relations. For some folks, they have intrinsic responsibilities based on your clan animal or what clan you belong to, and this relationship with the rest of creation, and certainly this responsibility to harvest, to take care, to respect, to remember that it is a relative and not a resource. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So with that, I mean, there's been a lot of commodification of the land, animals, water, minerals, where view them as relatives. They've been viewed through a lens of being resources, through their domestication. So I completed a 2-day fast, and I was, no food, no water, no shelter up on Sugar Island, and that was just this perspective of being able to view food no longer through that, I'd say, resource lens, but a living being and spirit. So there were three animals or relatives who gave up their way of life for our benefit. So you had Bishiki, the cow, and if you want to go to the next slide, you have Bakakawen, the chicken, and then the next is Gukush. And if you really like reflect, Joe Surratt in particular, he's one mentor I've gone through sweats and other things. He mentions it, throughout the entire day through some of these factory farms and things. It's like, what does a cow and pig do? And for a lot of them, they're standing around, sleeping and eating. And he mentioned that chickens are very nervous birds, and you can just see it's reflected in some of the people and individuals and their behavior and what they consume. So then what he mentioned is for these more traditional food sources. So if you want to go to the next slide. So you have like Wawashkeshi, deer, and then you have Mashkode, Vijiki, bison. And next slide, please. You have Wabus, and then next slide, and Misise, turkey. And if you just look at those animals like the wild turkey compared to, say, those other three animals, they're active, they're agile, they're always on the move, they're always on the go. Um, so just for myself, one personal step, and this may be a privilege, not everyone has this luxury, but really returning to some of these traditional food sources, really limiting other, really kind of having that awareness. And just with those food sources, there are those ceremonies, the sweat lodge, fasting camp, women, or when they finally go to their moon time, or when they become a woman through puberty, for some Anishinaabe, they go on a berry fast. So for a year, no strawberries, no blueberries, no berries. And then if you want to go to the next slide, please. And plain and simple, you cannot talk about being sovereign if you cannot feed yourself. And next slide, please. This is from the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, but there is that component for food sovereignty regarding food security. There were urban relocation programs by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, putting people in urban areas. In Michigan, we have some very rural and remote communities in the Upper Peninsula, lack the infrastructure, of getting traditional diets and some processed commodities. as far as food access, transportation, proximity, um, municipalities limiting, permitting what you can harvest or where you can go, fishing rights being limited by state permits as well. And then you have the whole element of food justice, so that's confronting that inequity that is the result of systematic food injustice for some of these communities through forced relocation and all these other sorts of, bureaucratic tactics and things. Additionally, you have food policy and governance. So that's just some of the agricultural laws. I think they lack kind of that recognition of indigenous authority, a different mindset, lack of cultural competency, and just the oversight and level of sort of erasure as well. And that also can be reflected in the child welfare system and even, some of these cases on ICWA or CPS workers. I feel like really sort of lacking that cultural competency, not having that understanding, not having the training, or not even sort of taking that time. And then just really for the food sovereignty, not being dependent and reliant on some of these colonial infrastructures and systems. Um, you know, Shiloh Maples, an Anishinaabe seed keeper and organizer, has a quote: "Our seeds are our relatives. They're living beings, so we need to treat them with the utmost respect." And lastly, land access, justice, and sovereignty. Certainly some overlap, but zoning laws, commodification of the land, but I think really refocusing on the concept that the land is not a commodity, but rather a relationship that entails consent, recognition, rematriation of land stewardship as well. So next slide, please. This is just some artwork from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. I just like how urban setting they have like a lot of murals and they've got some other Indian centers throughout kind of an urban area. Next slide, please. This image here, I was going to jump into it, but this image right here is from Keweenaw Bay Ojibwe Community College. And this is a whole piece of artwork reflecting the Dodem, so clan system. You've heard the word totem or like totem pole. That's where it is derived totem. For a lot of folks, they belong to a clan. They have an animal or particular role and responsibility within that system of that clan. If you just want to skip forward, this is just a breakdown. Again, there's regional differences. Um, you're going to find it different as far as the animal or the clan or responsibility. So there is some variation. Next slide. Really, I think these are just some of the clan images, kind of just how that structure. But again, I said that relationship, responsibility, looking at relatives kind of through a different lens. Go ahead. You can just like roll through these. This is more of a breakdown again from the Ojibwe clan system. So you're going to have variation if it's Odawa as well, or Potawatomi as well. And then just this last slide, I mean, this is just my contact information. Um, all right. Yeah, I guess questions now. I'll give it's a 50-cent question if someone can guess who the man in the suit is. Am I still good on time?
Yes, you have no rush, plenty of time. We have 15 minutes before we have to like formally address Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Could you roll back to the mural with like the bear and the pipe? Yeah, this one right here. So like I was saying, each individual belongs to a specific clan, and depending on the culture or region, there are some individuals where it isn't an animal, but rather a element or a substance or even a mineral. Um, so one thing that I just want to reiterate with you all is as human beings, each and every one of us comes from an animal system, and really just kind of like marinate on that thought of that level of interconnectedness and how basically all of your actions impact others, on a day-to-day basis. I think we can kind of overwhelm ourselves with the influx of information and things happening, internationally, overseas, and around the world. And a lot of times it can be this distraction of what's occurring in our own backyards. So for me, my focus has been really on my own sphere of influence. But the other thing is like every one of these animals here on this particular image, they're an animal, they're a creature, and they engage in their daily ritual. And as human beings, we do as well. And sometimes we like lose sight of that through these distractions or means or other things. And the other thing is like each one of us, they call it a manadu, the spirit. Each one of us, each being, each tree, each rock has a manadu. And it's really how you treat that manadu. Is it a tobacco offering, or for some fishers I know and folks, when they take a ferry, they lay some tobacco down in the water, or they go for hunting or even harvesting and gathering, and it's that kind of reciprocity. And sometimes there may be a catastrophe or an accident, something bad happens, and people will ask, they're like, "Did you lay down your tobacco?" And it's like, "No." And it's like, it starts first. So this particular image, I mean, it kind of shows that structure of the clan system for the Ojibwe, we'll just say. All right, cool. And then, so one thing in particular I wanted to point out is, you see the Guggen, so the fish below Mikanek, the turtle. And within the clan system, these particular individuals are our mediators and our philosophers and the intellectuals. The one thing though is they're the oldest and most ancient of relatives, and they look at the perspective of the world through the lens of water. They're looking up, so they have a lot of star knowledge. A lot of folks have these teachings on star knowledge and that importance. Whereas, say you have other animals, you have Ajijak, the crane, and the crane has a completely different vantage point, and their focus is on being the external chieftain and leadership. Where you have Mang, the loon, their role is internal chieftain or leadership, and they have a different perspective. So I think it's really that perspective, and even each one of us kind of belonging to that system, having that role, having that responsibility as well. And then if you just want to go through those other slides, again, there's a breakdown. You're gonna have regional differences depending on the region, or like I said, Odawa, or oh yeah, someone asked to go back to the mural real quick. Um, for some of them, it goes, through paternal lineage, maternal lineage. Just really kind of depends on region and kind of protocol. So you're gonna hear something mixed, for some folks. I know for some individuals is like father's side was like Bear Clan, but then they had connection to Eagle Clan, and it was really seeking out a traditional healer or someone that kind of has that gift and skill to figure out your clan. Because I think a lot of dysfunction and conflict stems in our communities from folks not knowing their clan and their clan animal and their responsibility and the best way to kind of communicate or interact with each other. But with your clan, kind of that responsibility and that purpose. And yeah, if you just want to roll through. Again, another image, I said there is geographical, regional, some cultural variance in some of these responsibilities or what's represented. Um, and then with this as well, you have some subclans. And for the Anishinaabe, if someone is in your clan, that means you're related to them. That's your cousin. And one particular rule or law was you don't marry someone that's in your clan. Um, you marry outside of your clan. All right. So Q&A then. That's really all I had. And then yeah, just this last slide.
Thank you
So
so much, and thank you so much to everybody who is in this call. Wanted to highlight and raise a few, not hands, but raise a few questions that were shared with us during the presentation. Anonymous participant. Did I go over? Yes, this session is being recorded and it'll go live both on WebEx and on our YouTube channel. But there's minimal editing, so it might take a couple weeks to release it, but you guys will be the first to know when the session is released in our YouTube. Aaron asked, can you talk more about your work with freshwater?
yeah, so I've been really fortunate with my job, the flexibility, and from my previous work of working with Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians and other sort of entities, my focus was a lot on survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, human trafficking. Where with the North American Marine Alliance, we're kind of in uncharted territory. And the cool thing is, I have a lot of connections with these tribal entities and organizations and communities. So I've been doing a lot of more outreach, and it's like, hey, got a different job focused on the fish and, our local commercial fishermen as well. So with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and then Noggin Associates, they're out of Walpole Island, Ontario. We were able to do a clan gathering in Windsor, Ontario back in December, and we had 60 participants. And Fred Kelly, that I mentioned, he did a whole thing on star knowledge, where you had students, PhD students, more science based, but it was just a really nice blend. And one focus was certainly integrating the youth who's going to assume these leadership roles. That was really cool. And that particular gathering, we called it, it's an initiative called Inakagawin, and that is basically the sacred law, following, sacred law. And with that, it really dived really in depth on clans, figuring out your clans, and then breaking up by your clan animal as well, which was really cool. Kind of reinforcing those connections or some of these connections that may have been severed or, still kind of in the works. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. There was an additional question by Blake. I'd like to ask you about social justice from Native American standpoint. What are some examples of social justice from an ancient standpoint? Thank you.
That's a great question because you're going to hear a wide variety, especially with truth and reconciliation. I feel like there's still a lot of anger, which is warranted and justified, understandable. There's a lot of things I feel like it's forgive in some sense, but don't forget. I think we're really at a point of truth. And for a lot of these stories and things that were shared, it's kind of like no going back. The cat is out of the bag, and some of these atrocities and things that happened as well. But I think the big aspect of social justice is that truth, creating that exposure, advocacy, educating, When I first worked with a lot of these boarding school survivors, I'd go around and talk to middle-aged and elderly people in Michigan, and they had no idea about the boarding schools. It wasn't in their curriculum. So getting that, in curriculum as well, and I think really that education aspect and showing up for each other, for other communities as well.
Um, Thank you so much, Sydney. Sorry, Bronson. We have 3 minutes left and we just need to release our poll.
Oh yeah, for
So
sure.
please take it away, Sydney. No, I'm lowering my hand.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks so much, Bronson. Really, really appreciate your time with us today. And yes, dropped the link to the YouTube in the chat. There's a poll up just to like some feedback for us while we're booking sessions and working with folks for next year. And yeah, just really appreciate all that you've shared with us. And definitely feel free, everyone, to follow up with each other in the WebEx app or come and join us in person at South Shore Cultural Center on Friday. Excited to be together in person with everyone. Appreciate y'all.
Can I just add one last thing?
Please.
So the man in the three-piece suit, that's my Michelle Miss, my grandpa, Wilbur. So